So welcome everyone to the last webinar before the holidays on COVID-19 policymaking in the throes of a global crisis. A webinar I co-host with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who is here, University professor at Columbia, Yannis Ben-Amor, who's an adjunct professor in SIPA, executive director of the Center for Sustainable Development Solutions, I think. I may get confused. We're very fortunate to have a terrific panel of 4 people here today who are going to address the issue of the connections between climate change and COVID-19 and what we can learn from those. So let me do a quick introduction of our 4 guests, and then I'll turn it over to 2 of them to present, and then we'll go into a full discussion. So our speakers are Alicia Cooperman, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Texas A&M University, and she works on a range of issues, but they include civil society and accountability and climate change. And she received her PhD in political science from Columbia University. So welcome, Alicia. Also, Sara Constantino, who is a postdoc research associate at the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. I have to get used to saying that name of that school, where she works on the understanding of how formal and informal institutions affect individual and collective decisions in social ecological contexts. And she has a PhD in cognitive science from NYU. Sara, thanks for coming. And then we have 2 other guests, very familiar to some of us. Elke, who's the Gerhard Andlinger Professor in Energy and Environment, as well as a Professor of Psychology and Public Affairs at Princeton. Elke was our former colleague at Columbia, and yeah, we miss you, Elke, but glad you're not too far away. And her research focuses on decision-making, and she's done quite a lot of work on decision-making and climate change. And finally, Robert Keohane is the Professor of International Affairs Emeritus at Princeton University. He's a star leader in the field of international relations. He's been interested in climate change, which is one of the greatest challenges for international relations. He's been interested in that for a long time. And among other things, he's on a mission to get more political scientists engaged. And I agree that we need that. And he's successful at everything he tries. So he's really taking things further in the academy. So that's our group. I'm going to turn over now to
Scott.
Yeah.
You don't know about the failures. One conceals one's failures and one publicizes them.
Okay, well, we'll have to have another webinar about failures. That would probably all of us could speak for quite a while on that topic. But let's turn now to our younger colleagues who haven't amassed as many failures as we have. And in particular, Alicia and Sara. I'm not sure how you want to choreograph it, but I'll turn it over to you now.
Great, thank you, Scott. And I'll go ahead and start, and Alicia will jump in about halfway through. So I'm going to present some ongoing work looking at public responses to the fast-moving COVID-19 pandemic and the slowly unfolding climate crisis. Okay. So last September 20th, 3 days before the United Nations Climate Summit, 6 million people across 150 countries joined global strikes to demand action on climate change, marking the largest climate strike in world history. These protests were part of the Fridays for Future youth movement that were inspired by Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg, who said, thanks. Adults keep saying we owe it to the young people to give them hope, but I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. I want you to act. I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if the house is on fire, because it is. In this plea, Greta links panic and fear to action. But while polls show that climate change concern is growing worldwide, there's still insufficient action on climate change. Next. So in this body of research, we ask what drives people to take action or support mitigative policies in the face of impending or existing existential crises, and in particular, how personal experience with a threat relates to worry and action in a highly polarized context. Next. Research in psychology suggests that worry and risk perceptions are an important precursor to action. Next. And that experience with a threat may drive worry. Next. But it also emphasizes that experience is subjective, interpreted through the lens of pre-existing worldviews and values, social and political identity, as well as education and material or structural factors. Climate change isn't easily registered by our perceptual systems because it's the result of many disaggregated actions that are deferred in time and diffuse in space, and so is assessed using complex scientific models. In this context, trust in information sources, pure effects, or cues from political elites, and partisan motivated reasoning shape beliefs. So while extreme weather is increasing with climate change, it is unclear how this will shape worry, especially among Republicans. So COVID-19 provided an opportunity to understand how people respond to a largely unknown threat, how concern and attitudes towards the threat can become polarized, and what the role of experiences in shaping worry and action across the political divide. Next. COVID-19 shares some similarities with climate change. They're both global phenomena that require international cooperation, but have the features of collective action problems. They require rapid public responses, behavioral change, and upfront costs for delayed benefits. In the case of climate change, this delay spans generations, creating what some have called an intergenerational prisoner's dilemma. They imply differential risks and impacts for different demographic and socioeconomic groups with overlapping vulnerability between the two crises. And they both unfold at an exponential rate, so that delayed action means exponentially increasing risks. They're largely unknown and unobservable without scientific tools and models. Next. Despite these similarities, governments and citizens responded relatively quickly to the pandemic, prompting this meme about climate change needing to hire coronavirus as publicist to circulate in March. This consensus was relatively short-lived, though. Misinformation campaigns similar to the ones we've seen for climate change popped up, as well as growing distrust in science and divergent views about whether we should prioritize controlling the virus at the expense of the economy. Coronavirus policies diverged across the globe and across states within the US, and this growing partisan gap is reflected in public concern and willingness to act. In part, this may have resulted from the spatial pattern in the spread of COVID, which started in dense, largely democratic coastal cities before moving inward. Against this backdrop, we set out to investigate the role of experience with an existing threat and a looming crisis on worry, willingness to act or support policies, trust in government and messengers, and political polarization, with the hope of understanding how the partisan divide could be bridged. Next. So we're halfway through a 6-wave nationally representative longitudinal household survey. We collected the first wave in mid-April, the second wave, which we'll focus on today, in mid-June, and the third wave in the weeks leading up to the election. Each wave is approximately 4,000 respondents who are representative on age, education, income, gender, race, ethnicity, political affiliation, and region. Next. We merged our data with the Johns Hopkins county level COVID case data and the county level extreme weather risk data compiled by the Earth Institute at Columbia. We find that county level COVID rates and extreme weather threat are positively correlated in space. And other scholars have pointed to the high correlation in risk factors, especially for marginalized communities, to the two threats. So that experience with these two threats is likely to be correlated. We started by verifying that worry is indeed predictive of willingness to take action on COVID and climate change. So this figure here on the left shows the interaction between worry about a threat and the view that it is important for individuals to take action to mitigate that threat. We find a strong relationship between the two that doesn't differ much between the two issues. Next, we looked at how worry differs across the two threats and which factors predict worry. So we find that our respondents are significantly more concerned about COVID than they are about climate change. but also that Republicans are far less concerned than Democrats about the two issues. Recall this is wave 2 data that we're showing you in I think almost all the figures. So these responses coincide with the peak of COVID spread into predominantly Republican areas. This was mid-June. Next. So we also looked at whether and how different psychological components of risk relate to worry about the two issues and how these interact with political affiliation, which is what's shown here. So in this and the next 2 slides, what you see is worry about climate change in the figure on the left and worry about COVID on the figure on the right, with the psychological risk dimension on the x-axis. And colors represent party affiliation of the respondent. So we find that the lack of controllability, perceived controllability of the risk decreases Republican worry about climate change, but increases their worry about COVID, while it has little impact for Democrats. Next. We find that perception that the risks are uncertain or imprecisely known largely decreases worry about the two issues, especially in the context of climate change. So you can see that in the figure on the left. Okay. Next. And we also find that a feeling of dread about the risk is associated with greater worry across the board. So the finding that perceived uncertainty or lack of knowledge about the risk decreases worry suggests that experience with the risk may counteract this effect. Next. Okay. So in this work, we also tested the finite pool of worry hypothesis, which says that humans may have finite emotional resources. And so worrying more about one threat may exhaust worry resources and make us proportionately less worried about other threats. So what we find instead is that worry about COVID is strongly positively related to climate change worry. And this is true across across party affiliation. In a related paper currently under review, we find that this is also the case for multiple other worries. So we also look at worry about the economy, racism, terrorism, unemployment, immigration, and find that they're correlated. And so this suggests a sort of affect generalization where increased worry about one threat may spill over into other threats, especially those that are perceived to be related. Next. We also asked whether our respondents draw parallels between the two crises, since we were interested in looking at this relationship between concern about COVID and concern about climate change. And we find that on average, this is the case, especially for Democrats, and less so for Republicans and independents. Next. Okay, so as I mentioned at the start, our primary interest is in how experience with a threat shapes worry and willingness to act. And that'll largely be the focus of the remainder of the talk. So prior work suggests that experience with a negative event increases worry, but these findings are mixed when it comes to polarized issues like climate change, where partisan motivated reasoning can give rise to different interpretations of the same event. So this has been shown across studies looking at extreme weather experience. So here we created an index of self-reported negative experience with each of the two issues, COVID and climate change, which we coded and scaled to have comparable distributions so that we can compare their relative impacts on worry and willingness to act. And we find that perceived negative experience predicts worry on the two issues, especially for climate change, but that's partially just because worry starts lower, so there's more room to grow. Next. Similarly, we find that negative experience with a threat is predictive of an increased sense that action on the issue is important. So a natural next question is whether and how experience interacts with political affiliation.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So the earlier meme at the start of the pandemic suggested that COVID might be the issue that brings us together, that climate change could use COVID's publicist. However, by even the end of March, still quite early, it was clear that the partisan divide was strong. By April, there were protests against wearing masks, and then a Washington Post headline from just this morning argues that politics may change, though, as the virus gets more personal. So the topic that we address for the remainder of the talk focuses on under what conditions can we bridge America's partisan divide? And what role can experience or a partisan messenger play in this? So we have evidence that people respond to crises differently, that punishing or rewarding politicians at the ballot box, wearing a mask, or even choosing whether or not to evacuate during a hurricane may depend on the alignment between the political party of the information source and the individual. So these are things that we want to explore. So in this first slide, we break down the relationship between negative experience and worry by party. So we find that Democrats have higher worry on both issues overall, which is slightly higher among those with higher negative experience. On the other hand, Republicans with no negative impact of extreme weather, so that's on the left, are, quote, not very worried. And those with no negative experience of COVID are somewhere between not very and only somewhat worried. But particularly with climate change, where there's more room to grow, Republicans with more experience are much more likely to worry. So when Republicans and Democrats report similarly high levels of experience, they converge to having similarly high levels of worry. So this experience is helping to shrink the political polarization on worry. We also look at issue similarity. So I note that the dependent variable here is the same in both figures. So when we ask if both of these issues show that if we don't act before widespread effects become evident, then the situation may escalate out of control, we find that with no negative personal experience, Republicans don't see the issues as very similar. But when they have personal experience with either of the two, they're much more likely to see them as similar and converge with Democrats on this. Now we take a look at trust in some elected officials. So again, the dependent variable here is the same in the two figures, which is how much do you trust President Trump to act in the best interests of the public? And so we have a great deal of trust as 4, whereas no trust at all is 1. So Republicans remain unchanged in their support for Trump, regardless of experience with extreme weather or with COVID. Democrats actually experience a slight, what we might call a rally around the flag type effect, with slightly higher trust in Trump among those with higher personal experience. Now we have some additional questions on our survey about individual experience with COVID, for example, related to oneself or others, health related or economic related, receiving unemployment support for COVID. So these are some things that we want to explore in terms of unpacking this result. Nevertheless, Democrats, even those with more experience with COVID, max out at not much trust in Trump. And in our wave 3, we changed the dependent variable to take a look at effectiveness by different actors on the 2 different issues. So we're exploring that. And then we also look at support for the state governor. And because governors come from different parties, we took the party affiliation of the governor and matched it to be co-partisan, so have the same political alignment as the respondent or not. And we find, like the previous slide, that co-partisans are unchanged in their support for the governor, regardless of their experience with these issues. Non-co-partisans, on the other hand, though, actually experience a slight, again, rally around the flag, with slightly higher trust in the state government or governor among those with higher personal experience, especially with extreme weather. So respondents seem that they're more likely to cross the aisle in supporting a politician from another party when they're dealing with the state level than with President Trump. So next we look at a series of survey experiments about support for potential policies or candidates. So we're interested not just in what people perceive, but also their future actions and their likely support for different policies. So one way of assessing people's support for a policy is by using a willingness to pay question, where they reveal their preferences by saying how much they support a policy depending on its cost. So in this case, we ask about policies to compensate communities affected by climate change and by coronavirus, to see if respondents vary in their support. So we randomly assigned respondents to a value for the compensation. And there were paired questions. So each respondent saw a question about global warming / climate change, and they saw a question about coronavirus, and whatever treatment condition they were assigned to, they saw the same value in both. And these questions were in different parts of the survey, so they weren't being asked right after each other. And we find that as with most willingness to pay studies, people are more supportive when the policy costs less. And the support starts to flatten out, though doesn't go to zero as the amount increases. So in this slide, we break out the results by issue and by party affiliation. So we find that on average, Democrats are more likely to support these policies than Republicans across all price points. And this is true for compensation to those affected by either climate change or coronavirus. Now we break the results apart by negative personal experience. And this is where things I think get really interesting. We find that among those with low levels of negative experience, the predicted level of support drops off more and more with each increase in price, especially when the issue is climate change. The support is really low when the price is high for those without experience. But among those with high levels of negative experience, the predicted level of support stays much higher and flattens out or even slightly increases, even as the price continues to rise. And we include many different controls in these regressions. However, in many ways, this does make sense in that people with negative experience are the ones who are most likely to expect to be compensated under this policy. So in a way, their net costs may end up being negative. So when we had pooled the sample, the issues looked similar, but once we start to break things apart by experience, we start to see a lot more divergence, especially with climate change, which led us to wonder how this might differ by political party, since many other things did. So we do see that Republicans are the ones with the biggest difference in policy support, depending on their level of experience. And then we look at two more survey experiments before wrapping up. So based on literature from political communication about the importance of partisan messengers, as well as from political psychology about partisan motivated reasoning, where partisans interpret information in a way that benefits their own party, we have reason to believe that depending on who gives the message, people are going to respond differently. So we ask a question about emissions regulation, which allows us to ask kind of a comparable question across the two different issues, since emissions are related both to global warming, climate change in a way, as well as to the effect of many of the COVID lockdown policies on emissions, as well as the risk factors to people who live in more polluted areas. So when we look at three different treatment conditions, Democratic, Republican, or just a nonpartisan political leader who's endorsing these policies, as well as the two different issues, we can evaluate people's support for them. And we find that Republicans have an overall lower approval when the messenger is nonpartisan. So the green points are the predicted approval for nonpartisan messengers. And the respondent party ID is on the x-axis. So again, Republicans have lower overall approval, and when the messenger is explicitly a Democrat, the approval drops even farther. However, when the messenger is also a Republican, the approval increases dramatically. Whereas Democrats in the middle have an overall higher approval rating when the messenger is nonpartisan, and it's about the same as when it's explicitly Democrat. But when the messenger is explicitly a Republican, the approval does drop a bit, especially for COVID. So given the polarized stances of the two parties and the fact that any government policy to reduce emissions would be generally seen as a more Democratic party policy, we find that having a Republican messenger leads to the most commonality in approval for the policy. And then our last survey experiment looks at copartisan support. So the previous one focused on a hypothetical support for a policy towards emissions, whereas this one focused on a slightly more concrete, though albeit still hypothetical, action related to political participation and behavior. So supporting a candidate by voting for them, donating to them, or campaigning for them. This was a restricted randomization. So we went into this assuming that support for a non-copartisan candidate would be extremely low. So therefore, we were more interested in seeing how the issues compared to one another. So Democrats and those independents who reported leaning Democrat saw the Democratic candidate treatment, whereas Republicans and independents leaning Republican saw the Republican treatment. So what we see here in the plot is that among Democrats, when a Democratic candidate proposes a plan on either issue, the respondent is more likely to support that candidate. But among Republicans, when a Republican candidate proposes a plan on COVID, they're more likely to support that candidate. But when a Republican candidate proposes a plan on climate change, they're not really more likely to support that candidate. So overall, when a co-partisan raised a plan to reduce the threat of future epidemics, Republicans and Democrats did, though, have similarly high levels of support, averaging close to more likely to support that candidate. And then our last cut looks at this by negative experience. So while Republicans with no negative experience with climate change have much less support for a Republican candidate who plans to reduce the threat of climate change, their support for a co-partisan converges with that of Democrats when they do have high personal experience. Since co-partisan support for action on COVID is already quite high in the figure on the right, we don't see as strong of an effect, though there is still a positive slope across the board and a steeper slope for Republicans. So to conclude, we started off the talk pointing out that people perceive the two issues somewhat differently along various psychological dimensions. Climate change is less controllable and a greater unknown, while COVID elicits greater worry and feelings of dread. But this perceived risk is partisan. Democrats are more worried than Republicans, even after we control for local incidence rates and numerous quite important demographic and material factors. In particular, we really highlight the role of personal experience here in increasing worry, as well as willingness to take action, and that this personal experience can help to narrow a very divided partisan landscape in our country right now on both issues. And this is especially true for climate change, which was the initial interest of this research, and then COVID happened and we pivoted to explore these two issues and how they compare to each other. So thank you everyone for participating and joining us today, and we really look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Sara and Alicia. That was really impressive, fascinating. I can't say I've absorbed all of it yet, but I'm really, really impressed. Definitely since, you know, the way that I was trained and the way that I was thinking about these things, well, the way economists normally think is that people are rational. Of course, we know that that's not true. Anyone who's met me knows that I'm not rational all the time. And so we know that that's not true. And we also know, thanks to you know, a lot of great work by many people, including many in psychology, about the biases that people have. So we all know all of that. But what does seem to be quite remarkable about the era we're living in right now is that people's beliefs correlate so much with their political affiliations, and that whole thing is being manipulated. That's another side to this that we didn't get at so far here. So I think this is really, really important, this work. Let me at this point ask Elke and Bob if they want to add anything, and then I had a question, and then I'm sure Jeff and Giannis have questions. And we also at some point want to have a look at Andrew, because he's actually directing all of this from an outdoor site in Amarillo, Texas. So we have a little extra kind of theatrics here for this session. So let me ask Elke and Bob, do you want to add anything?
Well, Scott, I'll add one or two things. I thought it was a great presentation, and everything that Sara and Alicia said, I agree with. I wanted to distinguish some of the findings that appear to me to be expected intuitively, that are sometimes very striking, but I wasn't surprised by, from the findings that I was surprised by, and maybe even I'm still puzzled by. So I was not surprised by the partisanship, by partisanship and worry. I expected Republicans to be less worried about, especially climate change. I was not surprised by the fact that the more people see climate change risk as being in the distant future, the less they're worried. I wasn't surprised by the dread result. That is, that dread generates worry. And I certainly wasn't surprised. I've read enough economics. You should defend yourself in this way. Not surprisingly, willingness to pay drops off sharply with higher costs. I was I think that if we had one clear headline, if we had to write a paper with one headline, the headline I would write is that negative experience shrinks political polarization on worry, which is what our speakers emphasized. That seems to me a striking finding, and I wouldn't have necessarily expected it. If you told me, look, Republicans will be impervious to experience, it won't matter, I would have thought, well, that's plausible. So I would have regarded either that finding or the non-finding as equally plausible. And I was also very struck by the fact that negative experience virtually wipes out the decline in willingness to pay compensation. Although, as Alicia said, when you think about it, you realize that maybe people are rational, Scott, because people might be thinking, well, if I'm having bad experience with COVID or climate change, I'm one of the ones who will be compensated. So I'm not paying, I'm receiving. That's a pretty complicated thought, but the data is consistent with that. It's also consistent with a view that somehow they have more empathy with people who are hurt without calculating their own interests. So those are issues, the issues that I thought were particularly interesting and unexpected.
Great. Elke.
Yeah, let me maybe build on Bob's comments. I mean, the first point to make is, that the results in many ways, sort of draw on and vindicate many of the theories in my own work in the past. This notion of risk as feelings, that the kind of thing that motivates action is a more emotional variable, and hence, the strong influence of dread. Also, hence the strong influence of personal experience, because it's personal experience that activates emotions, negative emotions. It's not statistics that do that. And I think sort of the positive note that sort of personal experience might bring us together. As things get really worse, bad and worse, sort of we will maybe sort of react in more similar ways. I think that's positive. Maybe sort of temper that a little bit with like another angle that we really didn't present today. There's so many things we did, including some of the questions were asked in the Q&A that we haven't presented. But one of the things that sort of we did analyze was to what extent do people actually live in a parallel universe. We do have statistics on how severe COVID has been, both in terms of mobility, mortality, and economic impact. And the same for climate change in all our different counties. And then you're controlling for those actual incidents of negative consequences. You can see, well, who is reporting negative consequences, either on COVID and on climate change. It turns out that if you sort of analyze that as a function of people's worldview, people's ideology, not so much even whether they're Republican or Democrats, but whether they believe in science-based explanations or conspiracy-based explanations, you see that the people who believe in conspiracy-based explanations report much lower levels of negative consequences, sort of than the people who believe in science-based explanations, controlling for actual incidence rates. So that suggests that it's not just seeing as believing, but also believing as seeing, and that sort of in many ways we don't live in the same universe. We respond in similar ways to negative experience, but we're much less likely to notice and to register negative experience if it's contrary to our worldview.
God, that's so important. I think that way you put it just captures the moment we're living in right now. I want to share just a story from yesterday. I had a mechanic come to my house, and we started chatting, and the conversation went to COVID. And he asked me, he said, well, a vaccine's coming. He said, what do you think about this? I said, I think it's great. He said, would you get vaccinated? I said, of course. And he looked at me stunned. He said, you're the first person I have spoken to who said that. Now, this person, this mechanic, is interacting in a world that I'm not a part of normally, right? So this was so cool about this, is he and I just sort of came together. And I'm now operating in a world that he's not normally a part of. And I found that like really instructive. And what really blew me away is he then told me that the day before, his brother-in-law died of COVID. Brother-in-law had diabetes. And this look he gave me just told me he had doubts about what he had heard from other people about the vaccine. He fixed on me like very directly. So I think there's, wow, we're living in such not that this hasn't existed in the past, it has. I think the correlation with politics, I don't know, Elke, if there's a lot of evidence that this has been around forever, but it feels to me as being quite different. The thing about your work that I found very uplifting was that this complete convergence with experience. So the model I would have in mind, like a real, my amateurish first thought about this, people have beliefs, and those beliefs get translated into how they make choices in their lives, their actions. But what drives their beliefs? So one thing that drives their beliefs is the information that they get, or the social networks that they're a part of, and what other people are saying. And I think, Elke, you've told me this before, that people often trust the people in their social networks more than they do external experts that aren't in their networks. But what unified people, and this was, I think a really positive result, was having a common experience. So the question then is, well, we want to address issues like climate change before we have experience, right? That's the whole point. You have to act decades before you see what the consequences of those actions will be. And even with COVID, do you actually need to lose your brother-in-law before you're going to start to take COVID seriously? So that's where the expert opinion becomes very important, and people's beliefs that experts can be trusted. And that's the bit that's being torn asunder now by, these people who are, I would say more than anything, politically motivated. So those are just my thoughts about this. I don't know if you have reactions. I'm sure Jeff has a lot of thoughts on this. Maybe let's go to Jeff first. And Jeff, why don't you tell us what's on your mind and ask your questions, and we'll stimulate a broader discussion.
Great. Thanks so much for terrific work and terrific discussion. I wonder whether you have also looked at religious affiliation or epistemic views. Our country is divided in the most basic questions of fact. We have nothing like a rational environment right now. We have tens of millions of people who believe that the election was just stolen. The channels of information we know are profoundly skewed. And we know that it's also related to culture in very powerful ways, especially the evangelical white community, which is aggressively anti-scientific, aggressively anti-public health control, aggressively anti-climate change, and aggressively anti-government because of the belief that government is anti-Christian. So we're in a cultural environment that is absolutely stark. It's unbelievable. I'm sorry to say the technical word is a shit show because we can't do anything right now in our country. On the most basic issues, we cannot even manage an election anymore where the votes are counted and then a winner is declared. I just was 2 minutes ago hearing that the president of Ghana has won a narrow victory. It was declared. Now he's president. It took a day and a half. The other side didn't claim massive fraud and so forth. It just happened. We're not like that anymore. Every election now is heatedly contested, whether the president was born in the United States, whether there's massive fraud, and so on. So I think we're in a really deep epistemic crisis in this country where we cannot agree on basics. Of course, I regard the other side as not looking at facts. I will defend that position. So I don't think that this is both sides, just debating over facts. If you believe in science, the other side is just dead wrong. period. I'm going to put it bluntly, whether it's on climate change or on COVID control. And it's not an accident that we have 280,000 deaths in this country, rising 2,500 per day. And it's not an accident that we are the only country to have pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. In other words, we're not living in normal circumstances where we're rationally trying to discern the facts. And from the hate mail that I get every day, it's unbelievable what is happening in our public discussions. So I just raise this because I don't think it's partisan, by the way, as the first cut. I think it's profoundly cultural and identity driven, of course, which changes, which of course now has divided us by parties in ways which was not true 30 years ago, because one had friends and colleagues and so forth on both sides of a partisan divide. But now party is culture, is identity, is epistemic view, is fundamental issues that shockingly divide our society in incredibly heated ways. So all of that is to say, can you ask questions, or have you asked questions about epistemic beliefs in other areas or religious affiliation? Because I'm sure that I would suspect that that's a huge, huge divide. And this general sense, because I got into an argument over the last 10 days, the Supreme Court, as you know, struck down a restriction on limiting attendance at religious services. Well, this was viewed as absolutely, correct by a certain part of the country. I find it quite shocking. The Pope himself has said, go online, have an online mass, take care, be careful. But for the evangelical community, this is the most obvious infringement of fundamental rights and so forth.
So Jeff, let me respond. Let me let Sara and Alicia respond. But first, let me say this is not incredible. Ever hear of the Scopes trial, 1920?
I did. I know.
The Scopes trial, for all those who don't know about it, was a classic cultural conflict. The Democratic Party then was the anti-science party. The Republicans were the pro-science party. And the question was, it was the Scopes monkey trial. The question was a teacher who taught evolution and was prosecuted successfully. He was convicted, but Clarence Darrow and his defenders really won the battle of public opinion. It was exactly the same kind of issue. There's a classic work on this by Richard Hofstadter called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, which documents the long tradition of this. So the US is distinctive in many ways, and one way in which it's distinctive is there's been this anti-science element in it probably throughout US history. And it's always been there like a virus that becomes virulent and then dies down but never leaves. Now, Sara and Alicia will say something about, because we did ask about religion.
Yes. So we do not ask what religion people belong to, but we do ask, do you consider religion to be an important part of your life? Yes or no, as a way of dividing our sample in terms of more religious or less religious. So that's a great idea for including that in some of the ways that we cut our data.
And have you looked at that, how that relates to the answers on COVID?
Not yet, but that's a great idea, and making notes to do that next. And then we also have some other questions in terms of people's preferences for having bigger or smaller government, or the role of regulation. In kind of a series, I believe we borrowed them from the Pew Research survey that asks about kind of a number of different aspects of political beliefs, to recognize that Democrats are not all the same, Republicans are not all the same, and that within Democrat or Republican, you may have varying views on social issues, fiscal issues, the role of government, the size of government, international cooperation and foreign policy. So we have a number of different ways of dividing up our respondents into more nuanced ways of thinking about partisanship. So we've started looking at those, but this is a great prompt to.
There's a large literature that I've actually been reading recently on relationship of religion and scientific literacy. Looking from waves of survey waves, it's really striking. General social survey data. The evangelical Christian scientific literacy is very significantly less than other groups in the society, and aggressively so. And there's a big literature on this that I think matters, but it's of course, if biblical inerrancy is your view, it's very hard to process climatology or COVID science or much else. And so it is staking out a position that is, I think, really, it's explicitly anti-scientific, let's put it that way. And I had thought that the lesson, when I was growing up, I thought, which was long time ago, I thought that the lesson of the Scopes trial was that happened shockingly 60 years after Darwin, but that it was over, that was kind of the peak of fundamentalism after World War I. That was 1923, and we are 100 years later, and they formed the biggest base of the presidential party, which is interesting, but absolutely, in my view, the most important single reason why we can't get a response on these issues. The problem is we can't wait for experience. But it turns out, even the nurses are explaining to us in articles that as the patient is dying, they're saying it's not real, it's not real. So this cognitive dissonance or epistemic frame is so powerful that we're living different realities, actually.
Well, this is certainly right. But one thing I wanted to add, at least in wave one, and I haven't looked at wave two so much, we did look at conservatism on regulation. And of course, it's correlated with being a Republican. But if I recall correctly, people who were Republicans and very anti-regulation were, as you would expect, much more anti-climate change. They probably would be COVID, but I recall the climate change finding than those who aren't. That is, there's a motivated bias there. And it's clear that one element in opposition to climate change, of which Orestes and Elke and others have emphasized in the past, is that if you know, and you're correct in this case, it's not irrational, that if you emphasize climate change, that means more government regulation. And you hate government regulation, then you are going to be willing to deny climate change. And the same is happening, I'm quite sure, with COVID. I don't have the data from our study there, because you don't have to be a brilliant person to know that if you worry about COVID and worry about masks, that means mandates and that means requirements. And if you're totally against any government regulation, you quite rationally, we think it's crazy, but quite rationally then leap to being a denier of COVID. So I think you're right about the evangelical part, but there are other strands here as well. And one is the anti-regulation strand, which
I think there's
it's interesting to see religion, though, because there are also many, at least Catholics, who are very concerned about climate change, and this was part of Pope Francis's message as well. And so I think those norms might be changing, and seeing how they hang together with other, like anti-scientific norms. I think it might be interesting to see those dynamics. It's not clear to me which way it'll go in our sample.
That's why it will matter not only religiosity, but which religion, because they're very different worldviews.
Something to add maybe to the next debate.
You know, I work a lot with the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, very utterly scientific and completely, you know, starting from the fundamental view that there cannot be a contradiction between the best science and faith, which is very, very different from the evangelical community, where there is no Academy of Sciences. There's a rejection of the science.
Jeff, I was with you in at the Vatican for this meeting of the two academies, the social science and the science.
Yeah.
And it was really striking that the opening talk by the chair on the science side, I think he had a Nobel Prize in medicine, but it began with a discourse on human evolution going back, you know, more before Homo sapiens, let alone, you know, before, 3,500 years from now. So pretty astonishing that the foundations there, are at least more connected with science than you would ever see in a similar setting in the United States. It was really very striking.
Yeah.
It seems to me that what's happening is, wow, this is like such a profound thing. I think it is a lot more than religion. I think it has to do with ideology, with people's complete obsession with rights, freedoms, beliefs. And by beliefs, I mean a belief in something just because you believe it, not because it's grounded in, the usual scientific method and so on. And the alternative to all of this, which is in a kind of a grab bag, would be something old-fashioned that I think all of us were educated by, and that's a culture of critical thinking, of having methods, of looking at evidence, of hearing other sides, working to get closer and closer to a truth that's sometimes elusive, but nonetheless, that pursuit of that's what we had in common with one another. And I feel that is not, it's not the dominant culture. But instead people go back to things that we probably have basic impulses. We kind of like those other things. They're kind of comfortable. We don't have to think so hard. It's kind of given to us. Our networks, people share that. But ideologies, this obsession with rights, which you get on both the left and the right, it's all divisive and it's polarizing. And I find it's not, that's the thing that seems to be dividing us. Giannis.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I had two quick questions. One, whether you disaggregated each political party by level of education. And the second one, whether they were citizen, legal alien, or not US born, and whether that actually has an impact. Science is probably taught in a different way, better way outside of the US. So have you looked at that?
We do have that in the data, and someone else actually in the Q&A mentioned that as well. And that's not something we currently look at. We control for education, but we haven't, split up the groups or split up Republicans by education and done a kind of subgroup analysis or anything. But we do have information on whether they're American or not, and we haven't used that. So that's something to keep in mind. And Scott, to your point, I just saw some recent about this kind of ideological obsession with rights and freedoms, and also freedom from regulation. I just saw this interesting other work that looks at when there's a state, so it looks at social distancing data before and after a state announces a policy, and you see that social distancing is pretty similar across party lines before the policy is announced. Mm-hmm. And once the policy is announced, you see a big difference between the two. So you see Democrats kind of adhering to the policy and Republicans going the opposite way.
But it is interesting. It's interesting that so many of us, I was at many meetings where people would say, if we only faced a common threat, people would organize together in a common way. Like if we were being attacked by aliens, the world would unite, right? You've heard this. And the answer is no. We're not going to do that unless we have experience. But, as Jeff was saying, by the time we get experience, we may be dead, it may be over. So it's something about having to be able to agree and move forward together based on an understanding of the risk and the necessity to act on it in advance of the outcome showing. So that's the thing. That's the plus side about the experience, is that, okay, once we've felt it, we have a similar view. But the downside to it is a lot of things aren't like that. You can't act after you felt it. You can only act before.
So Scott, let me ask Elke, what as a psychologist, what her perception is. She's the one who has the most professional expertise on any of us on this screen right now on this issue.
So I was going to say the jury is still out what we will do when the aliens are invading, because I think COVID and climate change are not a concrete enemy. And I was going to sort of actually mention one interesting data point in wave 1, and I'm not sure what has happened over the last 2 waves to that. But when you ask people what caused COVID, the virus, one of the options was it was intentionally planted by a Chinese lab. 29% of the American public, sort of basically said that wasn't the main reason. So we're looking for sort of external enemies, sort of somebody concrete that we can then sort of basically arm against and fight. And I think one thing that's so hard about climate change and COVID is that basically the enemy is us. It's our own behavior and our own lack of cooperation and our own lack of sort of foresightfulness, belief in science responses, because we don't have direct experience of an action or inaction sort of going wrong. In COVID, it takes 2 weeks to find out whether or not you get sick. With climate change, it's going to take us 2 decades to find out that we did the wrong thing. So so you don't have that kind of feedback that you have when you're fighting real enemies with real weapons. And I think one question is how to reformulate the current issues in ways that bring them closer to the situations where our instincts are telling us we should act.
So that actually
very affected by the evolutionary work, Heinrich and so on. And in my crude version of that, this results from our hunter-gatherer backgrounds. That is, you had to act quickly, you had to respond fast, you had to respond to danger, and you had to respond with your group against other groups. And that we are sort of programmed to have that as an initial reaction, which is we're going to look for the enemy, we're going to look who's over the next hill and which lion is behind the bush. Is that just too crude, Elke, or is there something that you think that relates to that?
No, I mean, I think that's right at some fundamental level. Sort of we're responding to the issues that we had to fight in the savannah. At the time when our current responses were shaped, and in the longer run, sort of we will, if we have the luxury to be around that long, we will evolve, to develop, sort of more reasonable ways of doing this. But I think it's not a foregone conclusion we will live that long.
So there are some interesting questions I'm seeing here. Oh gosh. So one of them was something about, do you see any way of bridging the divide between public perception and the experts? Another one, for Sara and Alicia, based on your research, do you see a way to recommend public buy-in to climate change? And then another one, the final one I'll mention, and you can answer any or all of these, is there hope with the younger people? I kind of like that one. I mean, could this insanity, could the next generation, steer clear of the insanity we're in now, or are they going to be infected by it?
I mean, I guess in terms of thinking about policy recommendations here, just pointing to the ways that we had divided our analyses by experience and by the partisan messenger. So focusing on that and recognizing the importance of the messenger and the awareness that we exist in different realities and that we're getting news information from different sources. So it's tough to say what a recommendation would be when many different people are controlling different news, and people are getting news that is tailored to their starting beliefs. But we do have evidence of the importance of the partisan alignment of the messenger with the individual. So there's not one size fits all message here. We want to have different types of actors talking to different respondents, talking to different citizens, because people are more likely to listen to people who they already trust. So I think it's hard to say that there's one key takeaway here, but I think highlighting for people, reminding them of their experience, not in a way that's trying to reinvigorate old traumas. I think one thing that we need to be careful about here is that COVID is not a common threat. It has hit different demographic segments of the population in extremely different ways, with groups that are already marginalized being hit even harder, and those with privilege and abilities to work from home and, you know, isolate from others not being hit as hard. So same with climate change in terms of the ways that it impacts the population. So these are, as much as at the beginning it was, you know, finally we were facing a common threat that will respond together, it became very rapidly clear that this was not a common threat.
And I think that relates to the comment on age as well, where age has also differentiated the threats. And so you do see a lot more concern about climate change, you know, through these various youth movements and stuff. So.
Well, definitely something we're seeing worldwide is that leadership makes a big difference, both on climate change and COVID. You know, enormous variation from country to country and how these issues are discussed and the policies that are directed at addressing them. Andrew, you're in Amarillo, Texas, and you've been at the control board for the entire webinar series, and you've been just amazing. So in addition to thanking you and being a little jealous of your blue sky there, it was snowing here when we started our webinar. It's still snowing a little bit. Do you have any questions for all our panelists?
Yeah, this is a bit of a, I want to give like a big hopeful question, but it's a bit more technical. So I spend a lot of time thinking about climate change. It's what I work on, among other things. And obviously you've set this up as 6 cohorts, like you've mentioned in the chat here that there's a bit of a panel design, so you're trying to follow the same individuals over time. One thing that I think I've seen in the kind of climate psychology literature, I'm curious how you think it applies here, is that events can affect people's concern about climate change short term, but then they kind of revert to their baseline long term, which may be enough with COVID to kind of, you know, flatten the curve because it happens on a shorter time scale. But with something like climate change, that's a much bigger issue. So I'm just curious how you see connections between this work and that concern that's been raised, and how important do you think that concern is?
Well, we have a study which is in process, we haven't discussed at all, which does relate to that. We're interested in extreme weather reactions. So we oversampled some areas that we thought were likely to have extreme weather coming in the fall. So we did this in August. This is wildfires in California, especially, and hurricanes in the Southeast. And then we're like ghouls. We keep, every morning we say, is there a wildfire in the right place, or is there a storm? But a number of these places have been hit by extreme weather. And so we're going to go back to those same people insofar as I'll answer our question again, and see twice. We're going to go back to them probably in January and see if their attitudes have been affected by experience with it. So it's not just that in this case that they say they've been affected by extreme weather, which might be actually go the opposite way, right? If they believe in climate change, they experience it. So we'll know that they've experienced it, and we'll see if it makes a difference for them. And we'll have their earlier response in August from the same people. So it's a better controlled experiment or survey. And then we plan to look at them again 6 months later to ask exactly the question you're asking, because it's possible that if they're hit by a hurricane in December, there was one last week, they'll still in January be traumatized by it and think climate change is a big problem, but by August they'll have forgotten about it, or maybe not. Maybe they will have fixed it. So we're working on that.
That reminds me of the first climate negotiation session, which I think was held in 1990 here in the United States. The chair, I forget who it was, but the chair said, in going into this negotiation, we better pray for hot weather, thinking that if the temperature was warm, and Elke's research supports this, if the temperature was warm, people would be more inclined to negotiate an agreement that would actually do something. Oh my gosh, I feel like humanity is hanging on by a thin thread here. What a great session. Let me thank everyone here. Alicia Cooperman, Sara Constantino, Elke Weber, Robert Keohane, Jeff, it's been so much fun doing this with you. I really enjoyed it. Giannis, you've been terrific. As engaged and as helpful on policy issues as on keeping us honest in the science. Really, really enjoyed having you. And Andrew, amazing. You just completely reliable and set everything up, and you make everything really easy. So many thanks to everyone, and I wish everyone a great holiday as well. Thanks so much.